Shalom and welcome back. Today we're going to study wisdom in the ancient Near East. Now, the wisdom traditions in Israel did not emerge in a vacuum. You might say that there were two principal streams of influence that shaped its development. One of them is Israel's own traditions or salvation history, and we're going to study that in another lesson. What we're going to study today is Israel's neighbors, both to the east and to the west, and we're going to see how those neighbors already had quite an extensive wisdom and poetical tradition, and that Israel borrowed quite heavily from those nations. So that Israel was the beneficiary of this long and well-developed wisdom literary tradition in the ancient Near East. We know of rudiments of Egyptian poetry that go as far back as 3200 BC. And there were two principal influences. If we look at the map, to the east we have the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, which included nations such as Sumer, ancient Babylonia, and then to the west we have, of course, Egypt. So let's go first to the east, to ancient Babylonia, and namely to the Old Babylonian Kingdom. And the first text we're going to look at is the hymn to Shamash. So as we said, Old Babylonian Kingdom, we're talking about 1900 to 1600 BC. So who or what is this Shamash? Now Shamash comes from the Akkadian word Shamash, which means sun, and this was a native Mesopotamian deity and the sun god in the Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian pantheons. Shamash was the god of justice in Babylonia and Assyria, corresponding to the Sumerian sun god Utu. And it's interesting that in Hebrew, both in the Bible and modern Hebrew today, the word for sun is Shemesh. So clearly there is a connection between the Hebrew Shemesh and the ancient Akkadian sun god Shamash. So the Mesopotamian sun god and god of justice. So what is this hymn about? Well, it describes Shamash's attention to justice in the world, rewarding the person of integrity and judging those who practice evil. And by now we know what is the technical term for that. That is moral or divine retribution, when God or the gods reward the good and punish the wicked. So let's look at a short excerpt from this hymn to Shamash. When you rise, the gods of the land assemble, an angry glare lies over the land. What is planned by the lands of many tongues? You know and you recognize their way. All humankind bows before you. O Shamash, all the world longs for your light. So it sounds a bit like some of the Psalms, doesn't it? Except a different god. We see Shamash is represented here on this image with this disc of the sun god. So not particularly a wisdom text, but certainly an example of ancient Babylonian poetry. Now, perhaps one of the most famous ancient texts is the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish. And why is it famous? Because it's the most complete Mesopotamian account of creation. So you might say it's the Mesopotamian equivalent of the beginning of Genesis in the Bible. It dates from the late second millennium, so around the 11th century BC, and this text describes a cosmic conflict between the leading deities. So we're going to see similarities in the style with some of the poetry in the Bible, but also great differences in the content between Enuma Elish and the book of Genesis and other biblical books. So this is how the book begins. When on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name. There was nothing but primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Mumu Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. No reed hut had sprung forth, no marshland had appeared, when no gods whatever had been brought into being, uncalled by name, their destinies undetermined. Then it was that the gods were formed within them. So what do we notice in this Babylonian poetry? Well, it's an account of creation, but not yet of the created world. That's going to come much later in the text. But we see this creation of the Babylonian pantheon of gods. And creation is essentially procreation, because we see these two original gods. We're not told where they come from. So much for monotheism. No such thing in those ancient Babylonian texts. So Apsu and Mumu Tiamat consort together, and they beget the gods, as we're going to see, or at least we're going to outline in the next couple of minutes. So you're all wondering, what is this plot about? And you just can't wait to read this text by now. Here are two of the main figures, Tiamat and her son Marduk. So for those who can't wait, here is the long-awaited plot of the Enuma Elish. So as we saw to begin with, Apsu and Mumu Tiamat beget the gods, but these gods disturb Apsu, and he wants to kill them. So we're not off to a very good start. The primordial begetter of all the gods wants to kill his sons and descendants already. So a pretty serious rivalry here among the divinities. Now, one of his sons, Ea, kills Apsu. So much for the immortality of the gods. And this Ea now becomes the chief god. Now, he and a relative, Damkina, they beget Marduk, and this Marduk will eventually become the chief god in the Babylonian pantheon. Tiamat at this point is not pleased. She is very sad about the death of her husband or boyfriend or whatever he was, and so she wants to avenge the death of Apsu. So she elevates now Kingu as the chief god who is on her side. Ea speaks out against Tiamat. The rivalry becomes worse. He now calls Marduk to battle against her, and they go to war. So we have another god called Anshar, then Gaga, no relation to Lady Gaga, speak out against Tiamat, and things go now from bad to worse. Marduk is now enthroned as king, and he goes to war against Tiamat and Kingu. Who's going to win? I know you can't wait to know. Marduk slays Tiamat, and not only that, he makes sky and earth out of her body. So the sky and the earth are created out of the body of Tiamat. So much for creation ex nihilo. As we see in the Bible, God creates the entire universe from one word or several words. Here we see that creation, the physical world, is created out of the body of Tiamat, this goddess. Marduk next kills Kingu, and now he's going to make humankind out of his blood. So that too says a lot. It's kind of a very different creation of the human person in the image and likeness of God we have in the Bible. This is quite a different image and likeness. So the gods now set out to construct Babylon and a certain tower in Babylon. Now this is interesting because we hear echoes of a certain tower in Babylon in the Bible, the Tower of Babel. And so the gods now have this banquet in Babylon, and the humans are really not sons and daughters of God or of the gods, but they exist merely to serve the gods. So that, of course, is going to create a very different relationship, right, between the deities and humans. So at the end, we have this long list and description of the pantheon of gods, and Marduk reigns over Babylon. So that's basically your plot of this Enuma Elish text, the most complete Mesopotamian account of creation. Okay, let's go now from Babylonian poetry or creation accounts to Babylonian wisdom as such. And here we find some very interesting concepts that will help us to understand biblical wisdom. To begin with, wisdom is hierarchical. There is a certain hierarchical nature of the passing down of wisdom. So wisdom belonged originally to the gods, and there must be a type of process, a trickling down of wisdom so that it's given to others. And this trickling down is really hierarchical. How does it work? Well, wisdom begins with Ea, whom we just met in the Enuma Elish. He's also known as Enki, and he is the wisest of the gods and also a counselor of all the other gods. And we know, according to the Babylonian myth, that there were 7 pre-flood sages. So by the way, we see that Babylonia also had a tradition of a catastrophic flood that destroyed all of humanity. And before this flood, we had 7 sages that were called the Apkallu. And they were renowned as having great authority, and they passed on this wisdom from the Babylonian gods to their successors. So after the flood, we had 4 post-flood sages, and they were known as the Umanu, or scholars. Very interesting that in modern Hebrew today, Umanut is art, and an Uman is an artist. So what is an artist but someone who represents creation through beauty, through art? And so here we have these Umanu who basically represent the wisdom, the divine wisdom, and bring it down to humans. So from Ea to the Apkallu to the Umanu to human scholars and sages, we see this hierarchical passing down of wisdom from heaven to earth. So at the head of the gods and the heavenly beings, we have the god Enki, or Ea. From him, this line of wisdom descends through the Apkallu and Umanu down to human scholars. The human contribution grows progressively greater as the line descends. And at the end of this chain of wisdom is the Babylonian school of wisdom, which is run by the learned sages. So in other words, wisdom comes to humans mediated by authorities. And how is that connected to biblical wisdom? Well, we see also this hierarchical nature. Of course, not with a pantheon of gods, but we see God who passes down the wisdom to the sages, and the sages exhort the common people to listen to their words of wisdom, because by listening to those words, they're actually listening to the voice of God. Let's look at one example, the Instruction of Shuruppak. This is the oldest and most widely known Sumerian and Babylonian instruction. It dates back to the 3rd millennium BC. And this Shuruppak was a Sumerian king, and he gives his son Ziusudra rules of behavior and wise counsel. So this Ziusudra is an interesting figure because he is the Sumerian equivalent of the biblical Noah. In other words, he's the survivor of this massively destructive flood that destroyed all of humanity. And so this son is the customary recipient of ancient instructions. So as the new founder of the human race, like Noah, he's going to be responsible for passing on the divine wisdom that he received from his father, which his father received from the gods, and ultimately from Ea. Here is an excerpt from the beginning of the Instruction of Shuruppak. In that day, in that far-off day, in that night, in that far-distant night, in that year, in that far-distant year, at that time there lived one who possessed wisdom, who with artful words, who knew the right word, in the land of Sumer. Shuruppak lived, who possessed wisdom, who with artful words, who knew the right word, in the land of Sumer. Shuruppak counseled his son. Shuruppak, the son of Uburtutu, counseled Ziusudra his son. My son, I will counsel you. May my counsel be accepted. Ziusudra, a word will I say to you. May it be heeded. Do not neglect my counsel. The word that I have spoken, do not change. The counsel of a father is precious. May your neck bow before it. So what does this sound like? We immediately recognize some literary features that are very similar to what we find in the Bible. A lot of repetition, parallelisms, both synonymous and antithetical, in that day, in that night, in that year. And we see this rhetoric that has a lot of flourishing and actually does not say a whole lot. It's really preparing the way, establishing the authority of the Father who is going to speak to the Son, and exhorting his Son to listen very carefully, because the words that he has for him will be life-giving. So we see in the style how similar it is to some of the language we see in the book of Proverbs. Now, there are also ancient texts that are very similar to the book of Job, and they are known as the Job Analogues. So these texts deal with the perennial question of theodicy, of seeking answers to the problem of evil. Why is there suffering in the world? Why does suffering seem to afflict the just as well as the evil people? So we have 3 major texts. One of them is known as the Sumerian Job, otherwise known as Man and His God, and this is quite old, dating back to about 2000 BC. We also have an Akkadian monologue, Ludlul Bel Nemeki, which means I will praise the Lord of wisdom. This one is considerably later, mid to late 1st millennium BC. And the third, perhaps the most interesting, is called the Babylonian Theodicy. And this one is very interesting because it actually has a dialogue between a sufferer and a friend, and the friend is trying to console him and give him advice. So clearly we see connections between those texts and the book of Job. And I'll say a few more things about them when I get to the actual lesson on Job. So let's move now from the east to the west, and let's go to Egypt and look at some examples of Egyptian poetry and wisdom. Let's begin with the Aten Hymn. This is a very interesting text. It's the longest of a number of hymn poems written to the sun god Aten and attributed to a certain king that we see here on the screen, Pharaoh Akhenaten. This pharaoh is very interesting because he radically changed traditional forms of Egyptian religion, replacing them with what became known as Atenism. And this provides a glimpse of the religious artistry of the so-called Amarna period, the time when there was this correspondence called the Amarna tablets between Pharaoh and local kings in Canaan. Okay, so this hymn is attributed to this king Akhenaten, also known as Amenhotep IV, and he actually changed his name according to this sun god Aten. Now, Akhenaten, as we said, replaced these traditional forms of Egyptian religion with Atenism, and he declared this Aten to be the supreme and only universal deity. So Akhenaten actually forbade the worship of other gods, and this was a radical departure from centuries of Egyptian religious practice and, of course, polytheism. Akhenaten issued a royal decree that the name Aten was no longer to be depicted by the hieroglyph of a solar disk emanating rays, but instead had to be spelled out phonetically. So he was also a type of iconoclast who was against a physical representation of this one god that he believed in. Akhenaten extended this heretical belief for the Egyptians that Aten was not the disk or orb of the sun, the Egyptian sun god Ra, but a universal spiritual presence. Akhenaten's religious reforms, which were then considered to be heretical and eventually were completely dropped, his successors completely rejected his reforms, have been described by some scholars as the earliest known example of monotheistic thought. Why is this particularly interesting? Because look at the dates when Akhenaten lived, 1353 to 36 or so. So if you know about Israelite history, we know that the Exodus from Egypt may have happened around 1445 BC. Some scholars date it later to about 1280 BC. But in any case, we know that the Israelites would have been in Egypt for the preceding 400 years or so, and this would have coincided with the time of Akhenaten. So either he lived a relatively short time after the Exodus, so a century or so, or he may have lived even before the Exodus while the Israelites were still in Egypt. So you wonder, where did he get this idea that all the other gods are basically false gods and one should worship only one god that should not be represented physically by imagery and statues and so on? So perhaps, we don't know exactly, but perhaps there was some influence of the Israelites there. So he forbade the worship of other gods and the veneration of idols. So this is the earliest known example of monotheistic thought. Here's an example from the Aten Hymn. So here you see on this illustration, they're still adoring the Aten, presumably before he banned the representation of Aten as the sun disk. So Re is the equivalent of Aten, the Egyptian sun god. Praise of Re Har Achti, rejoicing on the horizon, in his name as Shu, who is in the Aten disk, living forever and ever. The living great Aten, who is in Jubilee, Lord of all that the Aten encircles, Lord of heaven, Lord of earth, Lord of the house of Aten in Achet Aten, and praise of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, who lives on truth, the Lord of the two lands. You appear beautifully on the horizon of heaven, thou living Aten, the beginning of life. When you are risen on the eastern horizon, you have filled every land with your beauty. You are gracious, great, glistening, and high over every land. Your rays encompass the lands to the limit of all that you have made. As you are Re, you reach to the end of them. You subdue them for your beloved Son. Although you are far away, your rays are on earth. Although you are in their faces, no one knows your going. Once again, the theology is different, but we see some parallels in this language in the poetry that sounds quite a bit like some of the Psalms. Now, speaking of the Psalms, look at this. Here's another excerpt from the Aten Hymn. All beasts are content with their pasturage. Trees and plants are flourishing, the birds which fly from their nests. Their wings are stretched out in praise to thy Ka. All beasts spring upon their feet, whatever flies and alights they live when you have risen for them. The ships are sailing north and south as well, for every way is open at thy appearance. Thus fish in the river dart before your face. Your rays are in the midst of the great green sea. Does this sound familiar? Perhaps a little bit, perhaps a lot like Psalm 104. You make springs gush forth in the valleys, they flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the fields. The birds of the air have their habitation, and so on. So we see this exaltation of God's creation in Psalm 104. The second paragraph on the bottom, speaking of the sea great and wide, teeming with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan which you formed to play in it. So a lot of parallels in this praise and exaltation of the creation, either by Aten or by the Lord God of Israel. Let's move now to Egyptian wisdom. Now, we've mentioned previously this idea of Mat. Ancient Egyptians believed that in all of creation you had a certain truth, order, and justice. The Egyptians believed that the gods actually implanted this order, which they called Mat. And you might translate this Mat as truth, order, or justice. And this was essentially present throughout all of creation. Where do you find Mat? In nature, the seasons, the fruitfulness of the trees, and so on. In the human world, in civic and social order, in the family, in laws, in right relationships with your parents, your siblings, in professions, among neighbors, and in relationship to the king. So this truth, order, and justice was implanted in the world and is found throughout nature and the human world. So Mat is not just some kind of impersonal order, but she is also the daughter of Re, the god of the sun and of justice. So, of course, this sounds a little bit familiar when we speak of some kind of divine order in the world who is personified as a woman. This sounds a lot like personified wisdom in Proverbs and other wisdom books, such as Sirach. So this idea of Mat that permeates creation, humans are invited and called to discover this order in creation in order to find wisdom, to live wisely, live well, live in right relationship with others. So we find this concept of Mat in several Egyptian wisdom texts, such as the Instruction of Ptah-hotep, the Instruction of Merikare, the Instruction of Ani, and the Instruction of Amenemope. And this Instruction of Amenemope is the most famous, and we're going to look at a few examples from it right now. The Instruction of Amenemope is a text from the Ramesside period, so we're talking 1300 to 1075 BC or so, and it contains 30 chapters of advice for successful living, ostensibly written by the scribe Amenemope as a legacy for his son. So this was characteristic of the new Egyptian kingdom, which had a type of age of personal piety. There we go, by the scribe Amenemope as a legacy for his son. This text reflects on inner qualities, attitudes, and behaviors required for a happy life in the face of increasingly difficult social and economic circumstances. So everyone faces trials in life, conflict, problems, And so the instruction of Amenemope tries to give advice to his readers on how to deal and how to cope with all the challenges that life throws at us. And so it is one of the masterpieces of ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature. And it's of great interest to modern scholars because of its close relationship to the book of Proverbs. So let's look at one example. Give your ears, hear what is said, give your heart to understand them. To put them in your heart is worthwhile, but it is damaging to him who neglects them. Let them rest in the casket of your belly, that they may be a key in your heart. At a time when there is a whirlwind of words, they shall be a mooring stake for your tongue. If you spend your time with this in your heart, you will find it a success. You will find my words a treasury of life, and your body will prosper upon earth. Sound familiar? Well, let's look at Proverbs 22, 17 to 21. Incline your ear, hear the words of the wise, and apply your heart to my knowledge. For it is a pleasant thing if you keep them within you, let them all be fixed upon your lips, so that your trust may be in the Lord. I have instructed you today, even you. Have I not written to you excellent things of counsels and knowledge, that I may make you know the certainty of the words of truth, that you may answer words of truth to those who send to you? So those two texts are so similar, there are clearly literary connections between them, that scholars have proposed that Proverbs borrowed quite heavily from the instruction of Amenemope, or at least this section of Proverbs. So some have even said that we're dealing here with one of the earliest examples of ancient Near Eastern plagiarism, with the influence of Amenemope upon Proverbs. Or perhaps less likely, but not impossible, perhaps Proverbs influenced Amenemope. But really unlikely, because Amenemope tends to be universally recognized as earlier, as we said, from the Ramesside period. Here are some other examples. Beware of robbing a poor wretch, of attacking a cripple. Proverbs 22, do not rob the poor because he is poor, nor oppress the afflicted at the gate. More excerpts. Cast not your heart away in pursuit of riches, for there is no ignoring fate and fortune. Do not strain to seek in excess when your needs are safe for you. If riches are brought to you by robbery, they will not spend the night with you. At daybreak they are not in your house. Their places may be seen, but they are not. They made themselves wings like geese and are flown away to the heavens. So an exhortation against pursuing unlawful or dishonest gain. Proverbs, do not toil to acquire wealth, be wise enough to desist. When your eyes light upon it, it is gone, for suddenly it takes to itself wings, flying like an eagle toward heaven. So you have the geese on the one hand and the eagle on the other, but the concept is the same. Basically, if you seek riches in a disordered way, eventually those riches will fly away and be lost. Now, so much for Egypt. To conclude today's class, let's go to another place called Ugaritic. And Ugaritic is this ancient city, this ancient port city on the eastern Mediterranean. It's in modern-day Syria. It's more or less where you see that brownish arrow pointing to there on the top of the map. And it was very prominent from around 1500 to 1200 BC. It was excavated less than 100 years ago in 1929, and archaeologists found many tablets in the Akkadian language and also the Ugaritic language. And this language, the Ugaritic language, is very similar to Biblical Hebrew. So all these many tablets that were discovered help us to understand the biblical text in three ways. First, they define certain words that are rare in Hebrew. So think about if you have a certain word in Hebrew that appears only one time in the Old Testament or twice. How are you going to know what it means if it's a really rare word and it doesn't appear elsewhere in the Bible? But then you find on some Ugaritic tablets, you find a very, very similar word that is quite common. So this means that this word was borrowed from Ugaritic to Hebrew, and it's going to help you understand the meaning of these rare words in Hebrew. Second, Ugaritic poetry helps us to understand Hebrew poetry. It demonstrates clear similarities with Hebrew poetry. And third, it informs us about the pagan theology that surrounded Israel. So the theology in Ugaritic was very similar to the Canaanite theology and to the Canaanite pantheon. In fact, many of the gods are the same that we hear about in the Bible. Only in the Bible they're the bad guys, but in Ugaritic and in Canaan they were the good guys. Who is the most famous of those biblical villains, who is actually a hero for the Canaanites? The infamous Baal or Baal. And this major Ugaritic text that we know of is known as the Baal epic. So Baal worship is well known from the Bible, from many of the prophetic books, such as Hosea. We see from Hosea chapter 2, I will punish her for the feast days of the Baals, when she burnt incense to them, and decked herself with her ring and jewelry, and went after her lovers, and forgot me, says the Lord. So basically God will punish Israel for worshiping Baal. Who is this Baal? We said it's a Canaanite god, the son of El and Asherah. So the word El already sounds very familiar. It's the same word, the same root as we have for El or Elohim in the Bible, which simply means God. So borrowing in the vocabulary here again between Canaanite or Ugaritic language and Hebrew. Asherah is known also in the Bible as a goddess, a forbidden goddess. So Baal is the son of El and Asherah, and he is also the god of rain and storms. So he is the one who provides fertility to the land. Baal was a good guy for the Canaanites, and his rival was Mot, the god of sterility and death. And here again, if you look at Hebrew, both biblical and modern Hebrew, the word for death is Mot or Mavet, the same thing. So again, we see borrowing of vocabulary. The worship of Baal included human sacrifice and ritual prostitution. That's one of the reasons why Baal worship was strictly forbidden in the Bible, because it involved serious moral abominations. So Israel's illicit worship of Baal included two huge problems. First, it was a spiritual adultery. It was forsaking the love of God, the love of the Lord, for this false god or this foreign god who in fact did not exist according to the theology of the Bible. And second, it actually involved real sexual immorality. So not just a spiritual adultery, but real adultery as well, or physical adultery in this cultic prostitution and fertility rites. So God's judgment in the Bible aimed at things sacred to Baal cult. So here we see a little chart of the Canaanite pantheon. We see Asherah and El at the top, the begetters of all, and then the sons and daughters of El, including gods and goddesses such as Anat and Ashtar and others. And Baal is one of them. Astarte and Baal are the ones who are frequently mentioned in the Bible. Then we have other gods of the Canaanite pantheon. Dagon is also mentioned in the book of Samuel. He's the one who falls down, or that idol that falls down and breaks in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. And others. Who are the great enemies of Baal? Yam and Mot. Mot, as we said, is the god of death. Yam is the god of the sea. And again, in modern Hebrew, what do you think is the word for sea? That's right, it's Yam. So all these words from the Canaanite language made their way into Hebrew and even into modern Hebrew. Okay, you always thought Baal was this terrifying god. When you look at this little statue, he kind of looks a little bit wimpy, not really so fear-inspiring or not really so awesome. And in any case, that's a little statuette of Baal that we found in Ugaritic. So here is an excerpt from the Baal epic. There the gods had sat down to eat, the holy ones to a meal. Baal was standing by El. As soon as the gods saw the messengers of sea, the mission of Judge River, the gods lowered their heads to the top of their knees and onto their princely seats. Baal rebuked them. Gods, why have you lowered your heads to the top of your knees and onto your princely seats? I see, gods, that you are stricken with fear of the messengers of sea. That's Yam, the god of the sea. The mission of Judge River. Gods, raise your heads from the top of your knees, from your princely seats, for I will reply to the messengers of sea, the mission of Judge River. So basically, Baal calling the gods to task to not be afraid of Si or Yam and his own messengers. So he's really giving them a pep talk before they go to war against their enemies. So now I know you're all dying to hear about this plot of the Baal epic. Well, here it is, and I tell you it's a real page-turner. So what happens in this Baal epic? Yam, the sea god, wants to rule over the other gods and be the most powerful of all. Now Baal, otherwise known as Baal Hadad, opposes Yam and slays him. Baal then, with the help of Anat and Athirat, persuades El to allow him a palace as a reward for slaying Yam. Baal now commissions Kothar Wachasis to build him this palace, and now the king of the gods and ruler of the world seeks to subjugate Mot, his next rival. Mot unfortunately kills Baal Hadad, so we see some massive dramatic development happening here. Now Anat is going to brutally kill Mot, grind him up, and scatter his ashes. So you think it's the end of the story, both Mot and Baal are dead. But no, Baal Hadad returns to Mount Saphon, so we see a type of resurrection of Baal. And Mot as well recovers from being ground up and scattered. He challenges Baal Hadad. Baal Hadad refuses, and now Mot is going to submit to him. So he's going to reject this challenge, and for some reason Mot submits to Baal, and Baal Hadad rules again. So there you have it, this fascinating epic of the Baal story. Something you would never know just from reading the Bible. So to conclude, Richard Clifford, in his book The Wisdom Literature, says that biblical wisdom literature is thus truly international, being found in the great empires that dominated Israel's world, as well as in the geographically closer cities of the Levant. No category of biblical literature is more completely attested outside the Bible than the wisdom literature. So clearly we see lots of parallels in the poetry and some wisdom motifs, but also some serious differences, especially in the creation accounts and the polytheism of Babylonian and Egyptian poetry and epics. And so certainly we see a difference between the creation of man created to serve the gods in the Babylonian and Egyptian epics, and in the Bible we see the human person created in the image and likeness of God out of love ultimately. That's all for today. We'll see you next time.